Hello, and welcome to the Architecture Foundation Book Week 2024. Today, I'm joined by Mark Pimlott, the artist, architectural designer, and educator. And today, Mark will be talking about his book, A Walk from Here to Another. And I'm going to pass over to Mark now to introduce himself a bit more fully and to talk through the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. It's true, I am Mark Pimlott, and I, um, I am indeed a writer and a teacher at TU Delft in the Netherlands, and a designer. And I have a very long history with the Architecture Foundation, actually, exhibiting there many years ago in a group show of the architects of this group that used to talk regularly on Sundays, which included Tony Fretton and myself and Jonathan Surgison and Stephen Bates and Peter St. John and Adam Caruso and Jonathan Wolfe, among others. But what I'd like to talk to you about is a small book, which is coming out imminently. It should be published by the time you watch this video, called A Walk from Here to Another. And it's a book which has been published by Timos, a small publisher, or not that small, publisher in Napoli, who are responsible for the Stylos Journal and a number of other publications. And this is one of a series of publications which are called Glyphi, which are concentrated or focused on the relationship between architectural education and practice. And so in the context of an invitation from the editors, Alberto Calderoni and Mariana Ascalese and Luigi Manuele Amabile, who said there should be a Mark Pimlott book, I have written this one. And I have to say that it's a book with quite a different tone from other books I've previously written, notably Without and Within from 2007, or In Passing from 2010, which is a book of photographs, or my most recent book, The Public Interior as Idea and Project, which was published in 2016 and reprinted again last year. All three of these being published by Yapsam Books in the Netherlands. This book, in a way, has quite a different character to it. And the character I really wanted it to have is indeed embedded in the title. That I wanted somehow to speak to a younger architect, or architect coming into being. And really this is a development of a long period of teaching, really since the mid-1980s. And since I am going to cease teaching fairly soon, it seemed like a good opportunity to imagine how one might speak to an architect about how to begin. And it was inspired in part by Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, which is a kind of one-sided exchange, if you will, a series of letters written to a poet who has written them, written Rilke a number of letters, and so this is another one-sided affair where I am talking to someone who may be listening or may not be. And so the book was very much to be addressed to architects in formation. And the beginning of the book, because all books have a beginning and all walks have a beginning, was really concerned with the conditions that one is raised in and the influence that they have on one's making. And of course, the reference is my own making and my own consciousness, very early consciousness of this setting around me, the effects of urbanization and the way it shaped all the subjects around me, not just myself. But in my particular case, this coming to know what this landscape meant and where it came from, and the ideas that formed it, which were intended to form all of us, was an extremely important point to begin with. And what I basically say to the person I'm imagining on accompanying my walk is that it's important to know oneself, know one's position in the world in order to begin this process of looking. And I think it's, yeah, very important to say that the essence of all of this teaching and the essence of the writing that goes into this particular book is about looking and about being able to read and interpret the environment around one and to read and interpret the architecture one encounters. So I thought that this consideration of one's condition could lead one to quite deep thought of understanding of what we are made of, or what we're made of as individuals, how we are meant to be with each other, and how we are supposed to relate to authority. So now, I talked about the tone of the book before, and indeed it follows a kind of confessional tone, conversational tone, even a conspiratorial tone. And I did it in this way to break down a barrier which tends to be typical of architectural writing, which has its own density and its own opacity. And so I wanted to, I mean, this is a general characteristic of my writing, I wanted to find a way of just speaking very, very clearly. And of course, this is the nature of a conversation, but it's something I've wanted to encourage. And the book follows a kind of, well, a meandering character. There is a trajectory to the book, of course, at the moment, but I wanted it to have a quality which really did feel like the way you walked beside somebody who was talking too much, in a way that you would be distracted and look from side to side and think about other things. So intermittently in the text, which I have to note is in Italian and English, parallel text, there are these photographs spliced in. So you can be as distracted reading the text as you might be listening to my monologue. And as a child, when I learned to look, I did these long drives with my parents across the North American continent, and they sat in the front seat, and I sat in the back seat and looked at landscapes, towns, which bore a lot of similarities, but also betrayed a lot of differences, a lot of very subtle differences. And I suppose that training in seeing what was the same and what was different at quite an early age inspired me to think that if really one attended to the environment enough, some really important insights could emerge. So that was really part of the text too, that I was reminding the reader or the person next to me to keep looking and keep reading things and keep trying to interpret things. Before drifting off to think about other places, other appearances, whether they're familiar or unfamiliar. I think all of them hold images of the world within their frameworks. So being attentive to this is an extremely important thing. And the texts, in the meantime, would continue to explore how the conditions of the world, or the conditions that the architect was raised in, had been constructed to determine forms of behavior. And as I said before, relations to authority, to nature, to others. And so inevitably, it turned to what had been particularly formative for me, and in a way which something which is incredibly formative throughout the Western world, and now even in Asia, are the ideas that were inherent in the development of the American West. And I say development, I mean colonization of the American West and the genocide that accompanied it. And it was prepared by a rather innocent plan, or not terribly innocent, but a plan by Thomas Jefferson, which was a survey method of dividing this vast territory into a grid. And the grid was a way of describing land that was unseen, methods of urbanization, and methods of dividing property, and in a way, methods of promoting a kind of system of antagonistic adjacencies. So just by describing this instance, I could then go on to describe other instances of how people were affected by processes of urbanization. So, for example, the book starts to describe urbanization in relation to the development of Paris and Barcelona, and the kinds of effects that were desired in the developments of these cities, but also the equipment and the appearances and the organizations that characterized life in the metropolis. Paris being famously is called the metropolis of the 19th century, but it also generates the really most important typologies of the public interior that were designed to create a certain kind of urban subject, an urban subject who would behave in a predictable way, and an urban subject who was also, shall we say, forced to turn in on themselves because of the effects of this metropolis. And so more distractions come through the book as this is discussed. And this is Paris. These are my photographs, by the way. And one of the things I forgot to say about myself is that as an artist, trained as an artist as well as an architect, photography as a means of looking is a very central aspect of the way I work. And the photographs quite often concern cities and their environments and the fictions that are embodied within them. Fictions which as citizens we ascribe to and accept and affect us deeply. They are fictions that are projected upon us, and our consumption of them characterizes our behavior. But it seems to me that if we are more conscious of these appearances as fictions, that it would be possible, and in a way more aware of ourselves as subjects of these fictions, then we might be able to do more in relation to them. So it seemed to me, as I was describing this to the young companion, that a consciousness of the construction of these appearances would really help one understand what architecture did. And as you can see in the images again, which interrupt the book regularly, these scenes that appear before one are constructs filled with ideas and notions about life and relations to nature, and even innocent things like a shed in the middle ground, which evokes a barn, says something about the idea of how this landscape or a city is supposed to be occupied. And I write of these appearances as being utterances, almost like figures of speech which have been made real. And like all utterances or figures of speech, they have a form and a fact, but they are also, in a way, representations of ideas. And this is a very important point that the book is concerned with. that appearances are registers of ideas about how we are supposed to occupy the world. And this photograph, which was made quite some time ago, from the roof of Adolf Loos's Villa Müller, looking onto the suburbs of Prague, shows various ideas of the city at work all at once. You know, in the foreground there appears to be a village, and there's a road which is a complete anomaly as far as the village is concerned, which is leading out into the distance. And opposite the village is a suburb with a series of urban villas, and beyond that, the Plattenbau, typical of Soviet development, gathering people into a kind of situation which resembles the ville radieuse. So we have from village to villas to ville radieuse, and beyond that, the factory. And so all of these things coexisting, all of these ideas of the city coexisting with images that are particular to them. These are the things that I think that the architect, in understanding or looking at the environment, can start to appraise and start to become involved with. So the notion was that an understanding of the city in this way enabled one to look at various urban contexts rather differently, and then think about how one might intervene and add to urban contexts. I quote an essay by T.S. Eliot called Tradition and the Individual Talent, which, although is about literature, was very useful for us as artists, because we could see our work, and it applies to architects as well, we could see our work as being added to that which has gone before, and the utterances that have gone before, the ideas which have gone before, and through adding to those forms of speech of others, which are really ruins that have been left to us to occupy, the ruins of others left to us to deal with now. We could add to them as though we were adding to a canon which already existed, not the kind of classical canon, but a kind of an ongoing speech which has been going on in the environment. And so again, the photographs reflect these notions that are in the text, this notion of addition to ruins in a way, which create, of course, new ruins for the next generation to follow. And of course, within this is a notion that one has to be acutely attuned to the environment one makes work in. So the walk continues in this way, and at this point, I really start to talk about the nature of appearance as being closely involved with representation, which to me isn't a kind of dead thing, but something which is very, very significant and about life, really. If we see the utterance or the representation as something which contains an idea which has been manifest in some sort of surface, then that surface tells something of the life and reality that exists beneath it. And I write about this bit from Shakespeare in the play A Winter's Tale, which I can't go through now, but a central moment in the play concerns the dead, or representation of the assumed dead person being brought to life. And the moment when this statue becomes real, the statue there's this kind of transgression of the surface of representation stepping into real life. And it seemed to me that the city and all of its artifacts and its landscapes are similarly charged, that we can see them as representations of ideas and of intentions. And so I go back to the story of architecture and Gottfried Semper and his notion of the Carib hut, the primitive hut, which is made of elements of building, each attribute to a different kind of work. The people who make the ground, the people who make the hearth, the people who make the timber frame and the roof, and ultimately the people who make the enclosure which protects the interior from the exterior. And all of these, and perhaps the last in particular, are meant to be communicative. There's an idea about covering the earth, an idea about how the hearth is supposed to gather people, both functional and symbolic meaning, the idea that is communicated in the frame and the way that the frame is put together, and ultimately the weaving of this partition, which of course is related to writing and related to text. And this partition is the kind of communicative element that speaks to all the other elements. So the notion that architecture could be seen not just as an assembly of elements or a kind of phenomenological experience for the body, but actually something which speaks of ideas, was the way I was asking my young companion to look at the environment. And again, the photographs evoke different notions and different ideas which are present in the environment all around, from the Garden of Eden to perhaps the ruins of the temple. So I'm trying to set up, or try to set up this point, well, how do we address that possibility of representation in the environment? And I return to the 19th century urbanization or territorialization of the American West, and a particular photographer, a topographical photographer called Timothy O'Sullivan, who, unlike other photographers of these great surveys which were meant to document the American West and sell it to the East and to international investors as a kind of Eden, O'Sullivan addressed this landscape through his photography as though it was other and strange, and that he recognized his distance from it, that his images weren't about projecting a notion of Eden upon the landscape, but actually accepting it and its occupants, because he made photographs of indigenous people as well, for what they were. And there is something in the process of making his photographs, at least as I read them, which had to do with, if you stop projecting and allow the other to express itself, then the boundaries of the self are kind of loosened, and there's this movement towards the other. And this, of course, is the essence of the title of the book as well, A Walk from Here to Another, that it is about establishing empathy as a notion that is central to architectural thinking. And like this, I also return to John Berger's writing about the German photographer, 20th century photographer, August Sander, and his portraits of people. In this project that he made, People of the 20th Century, where for many years he made studio photographs and photographs in live settings of people in their forms of attire, which are very often uniforms. And there's a famous essay, very short essay I referred to, called The Suit and the Photograph, which compares two groups of men, one country musicians and the other people of a kind of banker society, I believe, who are both in suits. They're all dressed in suits. And the first group dressed in suits, they're kind of wearing them kind of proudly, but there's clearly they're not wearing suits in the way that suits are supposed to be worn. And there's a kind of performance and a setting in themselves for the camera, which has to do with their attitude to the relation to the suit. And the gentlemen who are from the society wear it as though it was like part of their skin. There's no discomfort at all. There's no performance. They just appear because that is their appearance. And then his photographs continue to look at people of all kinds. This is one of a bricklayer's mate in his work attire, And what happens between the photographer and his subjects, I believe, is a kind of meeting where there's this presentation of the subject to the photographer and this moving towards the subject that happens within the photographer. And this seemed to be, this attitude, if you will, seemed to be a model for how one could proceed as an architect, or how one really needed to proceed as an architect. It required a degree of humility and a surrendering of notions of projection. As you can tell, projection as a kind of, well, it's unavoidable in design, of course, but there's a difference between the kind of projection which says this idea will be cast over the earth and the notion that a projection has to take place after a kind of understanding or a meeting has taken place. And I tend to look at the world as or look at the architecture in a way as I want to look at these people in suits, that there's a kind of desire to protect an image, a kind of appearance, which is a failure, but contains kind of valuable insights into what the essence of the architecture is. And that's how I go about introducing the notion of how one might begin. And there's a key reference for me, which I also talk about with the in the book, which is from an Italian artist called Michelangelo Pistoletto, and a series of works he made in the 1960s called Oggetti in meno, minus objects, which were sculptures, for the most part, three-dimensional things, where the viewer, in his studio where these two major installations of this work were staged, viewers were kind of presented with things which were all crowded around each other. But furthermore, they all suggested items that could be used and engaged with. And for example, in the middle ground here, you see a structure for standing, and there are other photographs of people kind of leaning against it. And it seemed to me that in these works, another one from the series called Casa in Misura d'Uomo, or Man-Sized House, where this world of fictional things, these artworks, living in a world of representation, invite the viewer to join them. And a motif in Pistoletto's work is that, in a way, you step through the threshold of representation from the actual world into representation and see that world of representation as being like your own. In a way, it's a kind of reverse of the process of the statue in the Shakespeare play moving into life. You move into this other space, which isn't exactly death, but it's a space of fictions that you can engage in. And Pistoletto's project tried to say, I believe, that the world that we make around us is similarly a fictional world which we can enter and engage with and play with and speak to. So that's an important model, and it's one which has been highly relevant to me in my own practice as an artist and as an architect, where I developed not only notion of objects which were which pretended to be useful, fictional objects which were almost plausible as real things, but also a notion of objects which were highly dependent on each other for understanding and contingent upon the qualities of the spaces that they were in as well, so that the boundaries between the works would be difficult to ascertain, but also the boundaries between the works themselves and the environments that they found themselves in. In other words, the whole environment could be thought of as being fictional, a fiction that the viewer was very much a part of. And so the book more or less ends with a description of a couple of projects of mine in architecture, which, or however you want to call them, they're permanent artworks and they're interiors, which which engaged with their environments, saw them as being fictional constructs, ideas embedded in them, and added to them as one might add to the text in the T.S. Eliot's essay. And this is in Wales, in Aberystwyth, on a campus whose architecture was Corbusian, but also highly charged with notions of the Italian hill town and classical Greece. And so this artifact called a scala was added to them in the manner of the architecture of the buildings around, but also in the manner of adding to the essence of the idea which was embedded in this environment. And the idea suggested this particular reification of the Italian hill town in the classical scene, and it overlooks this landscape and the city and the sea. And the object of talking about this project was to say that it was possible to engage with this environment and read this environment not just as a series of physical facts, but the manifestation of hopes and ideas, which in this case people had discarded because they were so associated with the 1960s, but people had invested in and agreed upon and had thought were valuable. And so actually stepping into those ideas and those fictions and revalidating them through this work was an important notion, and actually an important notion when we're thinking about how to look at the city as we make it. Similarly, in working with Tony Fratton on the Red House, I understood that his division of the house into various parts were consistent with notions of particular stories or narratives or kinds of architecture which existed on each floor. So the object of my work in the interior was to enhance those fictions, to make them more visible through, slight alterations, quite often to do with ceilings or certain kinds of material or certain articulations of these forms, which brought those fictions out to the surface. And that fictional aspect of both our work was the subject of this installation at the Biennale. And I bring this out because I speak of it as a stage set, really, as an architectural proposition whose ideas are foregrounded, that one moves around it or moved around it as though arriving in a piazza, and then in a monumental space, and then in an interior. So hence the name Piazza Salone. It's a kind of arrangement of artifacts, fictional artifacts, ghosts, which contributed to making a very particular kind of environment. And finally, I think it's nearly finally now, that all of these works were indebted to imagining not only the fictions or the narratives which are embedded in the city, but the kinds of subjects and subjectivities that were produced. And this work in London, called World at the BBC, is a landscape which you walk over, which has the names of other places. And those other places, of course, immediately evoke perhaps the lives of those people or memories or images that you may have of them, even though you've never encountered them. That some of them are merely evocative because of the names themselves. But as you walk across the surface, whose names are organized in kind of constellations of association, you can imagine the other. And I think that's the essence of the book, imagining the condition of the other, the reality of the other, and moving towards them. And so I'll just read the last paragraph, because in a way it's a summary of the whole thing, and it might entice readers to read it. So we have spoken about this, you and I, recognizing the meeting of the other as a moment of significance, at once a reconciliation and a beginning, reached through listening, a kind of surrender, through empathy, through imagination of the condition of the other, others, all lives, all times past and present, all lives and times to come, almost unimaginable, and taking care, taking responsibility, and taking this moment as an artist, an architect, an interpreter into one's own hands, a moment that can be understood or realized as a walk from here to another. So that's the book, and that's the end. And I'll just say one last thing about the book. It's 180 pages long and it's hand-sized, and it was written in 2 sittings. So it's, in a way, it has the character of a stream of consciousness as well. I mean, it has a structure and it's very structured, but the notion is that you might be able also to read it in just one sitting. And I think that's also important to its character, that reading it is like following a conversation that would happen between 2 people. So I'd like to thank you very much for letting me tell you about the book. And I hope that you will be able to have it in your hands soon.